What's up, Game Devs? Tony Chan here. Sorry I haven't spoken to you for a while, but that would change now because I will start doing this every week where I give you a little update about myself and also prepare you for the next episode. So yeah, let's go ahead and get right to it. As for me, I started using Construct 3 to make my next game. It's going to be a top-down shooter, survivor, sort of like the top-down shooter of Resident Evil 4. That's my goal. And you can check out my progress on the social media at Game Dev Loadout. And for this episode, I interviewed Michael Futter, author of the Game Dev Business Handbook. 8+ years of experience in the game industry. Here are 3 key things you're going to learn from this episode. 1, why you need to evaluate your opportunity cost, where you should be focusing on your strength and not your weakness. So don't waste time with your weakness, okay? Second, avoiding the founder syndrome, which is basically where you're the one that's leading the team, where you're not open for people's ideas or you just keep everything to yourself. Third, we talk about fair use. So, there's some materials where you could use, some you can't use. So it's a good idea to understand how it works and how it don't work. All that on this great episode. So I hope you enjoy. Go ahead, Michael, give us a bit about your personal life and how you got started in the game industry.
Sure. I actually left a career in nonprofits in 2011. My last job was at Lincoln Center. Decided that I wanted to get out of fundraising, and I had the opportunity to take a little bit of time and figure out what I wanted to do next. I lucked into an opportunity. I was on a gaming podcast once a week, and we also did a game club thing where we all played the same game and talked about it. And I met a gentleman by the name of Drew Leachman, who introduced me to a gentleman by the name of Ken McCown, who has run a website called ZTGD for, more than a decade at this point. Ken and I became friends, and I started just doing some copy editing for him right before I left nonprofit. So I would get into the office really early because I was commuting into New York City. And I had time in the morning, so I'd be like, all right, well, just, send me over some reviews that need to be edited, and I'll give them a once over and, make sure that they flow well. And from there, I started doing reviews, and then I started writing news. And then I got the opportunity to be the managing editor of a website called Rip10 for about a year. I did that through all of 2012, started in January and went all the way through December. It was, I was a stay-at-home dad at the time. So it was kind of like having a job. Didn't get paid very much for it. I mean, we're very, very little bit of money for it. But I did have the opportunity to go to my first E3 that year.
Nice.
And then, and so I left Rip 10. It was taking a lot of time, and I really needed to really focus on, if I was going to make a life in the game industry work, or if I needed to go and find something else to do and just continue doing this for fun. Over that amount of time, Game Informer was looking for a news editor. I was really fortunate. I didn't have the opportunity to move to Minnesota, where Game Informer is located, but they took a chance on me working remote, and I did that for about 3.5 years. It was a really great experience, met a lot of fantastic people, had the opportunity to cover really big stories, and really kind of carved out a niche for myself, covering business stories and covering legal stories in a way that I don't think anybody else was doing at the time, except for maybe one person, and that was Alexander Slawinski, who was the news content director at Joystick, and then he is now the chief operating officer of Bithell Games. So after I finished at Game Informer, Alexander and I had talked, and we decided, we'd been talking about working together for years. And he's like, well, how do you feel about writing a book about the business of game development? And I'm like, yeah, I could totally do that. Combination of my work as a journalist, my experience in business, and then, leveraging our combined networks to really put together something that was well researched and really had the voices of, what ended up being more than 25 people from across the game development community.
Nice. So, okay, let's talk about this business aspect of game development, because I think most game devs, when they think about game development, they think about creating the levels or the assets or the art and stuff like that. But of course, there comes the financial side, the budgeting side, you want to set up some kind of a scope or milestones with the budgets in place? Like, what is something we probably don't know about in the business aspect of game development that we definitely should?
It's one of the things that Alexander and I talked about when we were talking about things that absolutely needed to be in the book. One of the concepts that came up was opportunity cost. Because every time you want to be focused on developing your game, you want to be focused on creating the art, designing the levels. Every time you have to do something like pay the bills, or pay your contractors, or pay the rent, you need to talk to an attorney, talk to an accountant. Every time you do that, you're not developing your game. So we wanted to make people aware that there is this habit. If this is a startup habit, this isn't just a small game studio habit, where you feel like, well, I don't have a lot of money, I'll just do this myself. I'll just do it myself. And every time you say that it's not hard, I'm going to do it myself, you're taking time away from the thing that you're best at. So one of the things that we advocate for is prioritizing someone, even on a part-time basis, coming in and handling some of the routine business functions of the organization. So you want someone to pay your bills. You don't want to pay an accountant to do all that because that's expensive, but you can pay a bookkeeper. So someone who doesn't have a CPA, someone who knows how accounts receivable and accounts payable work. And chances are when you're a small studio making your first game, it's going to be accounts payable. You just have that person come in for 5 hours a week to make sure the bills are paid, to make sure your contractors are getting their payment, make sure they've invoiced properly. And if not, reach out to those people. So that person can accomplish in 5 hours what you as a developer who's not comfortable doing these business tasks might take 10, 15, 20 hours to do. So you're taking huge amounts of time out of your week, and maybe you let it sit. So if you're not paying attention to it, all of a sudden you're in a period where you need to get a build ready for a show. You're going to PAX, you're going to E3, you're going to GDC. And you're like, oh, I haven't paid my contractors in 6 weeks, and I've got outstanding payments, and now my contractors aren't working quite as fast as I thought they were going to because they're feeling a little jaded because they haven't been paid. So we really hammer on the concept of opportunity cost, and not running into the fallacy that just because you think something isn't hard, that you necessarily should do it yourself, because those things tend to add up quickly, and you end up burying yourself and not being able to get to the task that you're best at and want to be doing.
Exactly. You want to focus your time on your strength. And where do we hire people for like 5 hours a week? I was thinking if you hire someone that does that sort of thing, they would have to be full time or at least part time with 20 hours a week. But someone that does it 5 hours per week, where do you find that type of person?
I mean, honestly, you can go to, if you have a graduate business program in your city, if you have undergraduate programs that are focused on business, you can hire somebody for a part-time job. These are kids who are going to school to understand business. You're giving them practical experience. You're giving them the opportunity to come into a business and be like, all right, all you have to do is make sure the accounting system, is generating the checks, is up to date. And you're coming in, you're doing that a couple hours a week after your classes. You're not asking a lot of someone like that. Mm-hmm. And they are going to need a little bit of training up front. I think the bigger challenge is making sure that you set money aside for somebody to come in and set up your accounting system. I think it's important that you use accounting software to track your cash flow. And this is another big point in the book is really separating the idea of budget from the idea of cash flow. Because people think like, okay, well, the budget for the project is $100,000. We have $95,000 of expenses right now. We're good. Well, not necessarily, because if you don't know where that money's coming from, if you don't know when that money's coming in, and you have bills due before whatever revenue stream is coming in, and that could simply be the revenue stream from you working your full-time job and having money in the bank on your personal account to pay contractors, you need to make sure that you understand, like, just because at the end of the day we're in the black doesn't mean that day to day, moment to moment, you're going to have enough cash on hand to meet your obligations.
Yeah, you just talking about it. Yeah, there's so much to it. Oh my gosh. Mm-hmm. Yeah, having someone on top of that, definitely a big help. Give it to us. Like, overall, what are your key principles for independent developers to ensure like they start off on the right track?
I think you don't want to overextend yourself. We see a lot of people. The question I get a lot is, when should I hire employees? And the advice that I heard from a lot of people that I was talking to when I wrote the book is, you don't hire somebody until you know that A, you need that person full time, and B, that you can safely say to that person, we have some stability. We're offering you some stability. Because one of the most challenging things about being an employer is every time someone says, yes, I'm going to take a job with you, they're not taking a job with somebody else. They're taking a chance on you and your company, and they're taking a chance on you and the stability you can offer them. So if 3 months down the road, you say to that person, well, I can't pay you on time, can you just hold your paycheck for me? And I've been in a situation, I've worked in situations where an employer has said to me, I need you to hold your paycheck for a few days. And that's scary and it's frustrating. And it absolutely destroys morale. So, you want to make sure that you have enough runway to keep that person employed. I often recommend to people that if you can ethically bring people on as contractors, then that's the better place for you to start. And what I mean by ethically bring people on as contractors is there's a problem across a number of sectors, but I see it a lot in the gaming industry where people are hired on for long periods of time as contractors. But if that person ever went to the IRS and said, hey, I don't think I'm actually a contractor, I think they're actually treating me as an employee, there could be a problem for that employer. And there's a multi-part test, and it's more art than science. There's no specific formula when you look at the factors of this test. But if you are, as an employer, dictating that a person be in the office, they have to come to the office 5 days a week, right? You expect them during normal periods to be there from 9 till 5. You give them the tools to work with. You're providing them a computer, for instance. You're paying for their licenses for all their software. If you are dictating specifically what it is they're working on at every step of the process, that person, you might be paying them as a contractor. What that means is you're not paying withholding. You're not paying your part of the taxes for the government. You're not giving that person the benefits of employment. And, in the United States, most states have gone at will. So there's not the restrictions that there are in other countries like Canada and the UK. But, if all of your employees, for instance, get a set amount of sick time or vacation time and you're paying someone as a contractor, that's compensation that they're not getting. So the ways that you do want to ethically use a contractor is when you're focused more on work products. So you hire someone, you're hiring a concept artist and saying, here is my ideas. Here's what I'm looking for you to put down on paper. I don't care what time of the day you do it. I don't care, if you're doing it in your office, if you're doing it in a coffee shop, if you're doing it in the morning, if you're doing it at night, by this date, by this deadline, I need X pieces of concept art from you. That's an appropriate contractor relationship. And a lot of people make that mistake and they just assume it's like, well, we're just going to pay him as a contractor, even though we expect them to be in the office and, they directly report to somebody and they have to be in a meeting or on a phone call or, we have daily check-ins. Like those are things that kind of tend towards somebody being an employer, being deemed as an employee when the IRS looks at it, if they are encouraged to look at it because someone feels they haven't been treated properly.
Yeah, it's crazy how something like that of being in the office counts as being an employee sometimes. So yeah, I know like there's like really specific laws or policies of what makes an employee and what makes it a contract. So yeah, definitely game does look more into that. But right now, I want to put like a clear picture in our listeners' mind, the result of not properly managing the business side. Cause tell us stories of companies that failed to do so, like whether the studio closed down or they lost a lot of money, or like you mentioned, it might have employment issue or IP issues. Like tell us some like really bad stories of when companies don't manage their business side well.
Well, I think that the end result is, every time you hear about a company shutting down, I don't want to name names because, these are stories that I covered as a journalist and of course wasn't on the inside. But, you look at games that kicked off really strongly, that had strong announcements, that had strong, closed alpha and even maybe closed beta periods, that spent big on booths at PAX. There was one developer in mind that had the most garish booths at E3 and PAX. They were like just throwing swag out into the crowds, and these games never came out, or they came out and they fell on their faces. And you all of a sudden you look at what happens to these companies, and you can trace it back. It's like you misspent your money. You decided to build hype rather than build your product. You decided to put on a show rather than put out a game. And we see people that overextend. This comes back to the concept of overextending and not playing to your budget. I think that there are times, especially if you get a publishing deal, it's like, well, we have all the money in the world. It's like, well, no, not exactly. You still have a job to do. And, you need to be careful also if a publisher is suggesting that for your small game that you kind of blow out on PR and marketing, because some of that stuff can actually be on top of your recoup. So if your game costs, let's say, $250,000, $500,000 to make, and your publisher's like, all right, but PR and marketing, we'll spend X, but anything on top of that is Y. And then they come to you and say, all right, look, we're going to design a giant booth for you at PAX. We have to buy that booth space. We're going to fly out because we have so many stations. We need to hire X number of people to work the booth, or we need to fly out, 10 of your devs. By the way, that's time that you're not spending in the studio that weekend, and the PAX Pox that comes after it, or Con Crud, and oh, by the way, your plane tickets, your hotels, feeding everybody, hiring those extra temporary workers, all that stuff is on top of your recoup. So before you see a dime after your game comes out, not only are you paying back the development costs, but you're paying back everything on top of that the developer or that the publisher spent. So you need to be really careful about what you say yes to and what you approve and how big you go, and how much you leverage the hype of your game, because it could end up putting you in a big hole.
Yeah, I love that. So do not overextend. Yeah, definitely scope out, make sure you're not overextending the budget, the plan, the game itself. In your profession, do you hear any bad recommendations from others that we should definitely avoid?
I think one of the biggest things that I would caution people about is, people who don't take intellectual property seriously. The number of times I've heard fan projects and the people like hanging on to fan projects is, well, it's fair use because they're not making any money. It's so weird how my experience in the nonprofit sector and my experience in the game industry intersect, because that's another place. It's like, well, we're not making any money, so we're nonprofit. It's like, no, that's not how it works. And just like that, because you're not making money on an intellectual property, if you're making a fan game, it doesn't mean that you're in the clear. It doesn't mean that it's fair use, because fair use is often not what people think it is. And a big piece of it is, are you improperly using, someone else's protected intellectual property? Are you doing something that might take away from someone else's ability to monetize their brand? And are you doing something that could cause confusion in the marketplace? And you can lose everything.
Yeah.
You can, and there are stories that I've heard from, attorneys in the process of writing this book. They're like, look, there's a guy who lost his family, lost his house, lost everything because he was flippant about, working with somebody else's IP. The best case scenario is you get a cease and desist. But honestly, a lot of companies are just skipping that step. They have no obligation to send you a cease and desist. They can just sue you.
And that's most likely the case, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that if you're getting a cease and desist from somebody these days, they're doing you a favor. Now, to be fair, on the other side of that, the intellectual property holder runs the risk of bad optics from people who don't understand. You look at what happened with, and I will name names now because I can rattle off a whole bunch of fan projects. There was a Star Wars Battlefront game that somebody was making, and I interviewed them when I was a Game Informer, and they said, well, our attorney said this is parody. I'm like, okay, then your attorney doesn't understand the definition of parody, because it's not parody. You're just using the characters in a game that's remarkably like Star Wars Battlefront while EA is working on Star Wars Battlefront. So good luck to you. Then there was another one. There was the Pokemon Uranium thing, and there was another Metroid 2 remake, and I want to talk about that last one. So Nintendo shut down both the Pokemon Uranium and the another Metroid 2 remake project. And when Metroid Samus Returns came out, there was a feature in the game that was added, because remember that was essentially a remake of Metroid 2, where Samus had a melee attack. And people said, well, that was taken from another Metroid 2 remake. And it's like, okay, obviously we don't know that. That might have been something that the developers had come to on their own. But even if Nintendo had said, hey, that's a really good idea from that remake, let's shut that remake down because, by the way, we're still working on this. And, and we're taking your idea. They are completely within their rights to say, okay, yeah, we like your idea. We don't have to pay you for it. We don't even have to acknowledge that that's where we got it from. We just can do it because you were working on our IP without permission. We have no obligation to you. You've essentially given us free ideas, and we can do with them what we will.
Oh, yeah, that's how important IP is, or trademarks are. Mm-hmm. It's, you gotta be careful. It's best just to use your own IP or create your own stuff because, yeah, you're taking a huge risk when you're using someone else's IP. Like, yeah, Nintendo, they closed down the Metro 2 remake and, yeah, of course there's like a fan base behind it, but still, it's all Nintendo IPs.
Right. But I think, and there were two things that came out of that. Number one, I believe that the person behind that game ended up getting hired on somewhere as a result of that. So,
okay.
For that person, it ended up being okay because they weren't sued. But the problem for any publisher is you've got people who are like, well, I really wanted to play this game. Why are you going after this little guy? You're just being the big bad publisher. It's like, well, you know what? They kind of have to. They have to protect their intellectual property. And if they don't, and they decide to down the road, it could actually work against them if they didn't take steps early to build that wall around their intellectual property. So you're going to suffer if you're a publisher or even a developer who decides that they're going to defend their IP. You could run into a situation where you're getting a lot of negative press and a lot of negative feedback from the community because you've got people who don't understand intellectual property. And what's unfortunate is that there are times when fan games get shut down for whatever reason, and typically the reason is because of a cease and desist or a lawsuit, where you have some journalists who are writing a story about big bad publisher when honestly that's not the case. And there was one publisher in particular who has pursued protections for themselves because of another publisher, another developer using a word or a pairing of words that were trademarked, in the game space again, because when you put those protections in place, it's typically for limited scope. Mm-hmm. So this publisher was seen by some journalists as the big bad for protecting a word, and the fact of the matter is they were playing by the rules, and you might not like the rules around intellectual property protection, but that doesn't mean that a publisher shouldn't protect themselves, because those same rules that gave them the ability to protect those words as they relate to video games and digital entertainment, interactive entertainment, are the same rules that require that they protect themselves once they have those pieces in place. So intellectual property is an extremely nuanced topic, and I feel like a lot of developers would do well to educate themselves more, at least engage an attorney. And there are some really, really wonderful video game focused attorneys out there. Ryan Morrison, Brandon Huffman, are two of the ones who I spoke with for the book and who I respect greatly. But find yourself an attorney who knows their stuff. If you're in Canada, Ryan Black, who I spoke to for the budgeting handbook, is absolutely fantastic. And you can find people who understand digital interactive entertainment on the legal side that can guide you on these sorts of things.
Yeah, there's definitely resources we could use to find something's trademark or some IPs taken. Mm-hmm. Yeah, because that question comes up a lot on Reddit, if we could use this type of music, this type of art, or just whatever in general. So definitely do the research. You make sure it's okay. Yeah, it just saves you a lot of headache down the line, mm-hmm. in case something do happen. For developers, like, what do you consider one of the best investments we can make? And it can be investment of money, time, or energy. What is the investment?
It comes back to the concept of opportunity cost. Is when you get to the point where you're forcing yourself to spend a lot of time doing business activities simply because you think that it's easy, or that you have the time, or you don't have the money to pay someone to do it. I think that's the kind of time where that's the kind of instance where you want to make that investment in hiring someone to come on even part-time to help manage the operational aspects of the business so that you can focus on the product.
What do you would tell people that don't want to spend money, or just like, because, we're independent developers, so we don't want to spend money. We want to try to keep as much as possible. Are there a way around it, is what I'm asking?
Well, I guess what I'd say is, you can negotiate just like you negotiate with an artist or a composer or a sound designer. If you want somebody to come aboard, and there are tons of young people who are, finishing up school or, available to do something part-time in graduate school, or maybe even have the wherewithal and can take the risk and jump into your studio, but you have to treat them well. And that means, if you can't pay them up front, then you need to give them equity. Or if you can't pay them as much as they need, then you have to consider paying them equity if you want these tasks done. And we see this kind of arrangement all the time on the creative side of development. Artists, I can't pay you everything, but I can give you a couple of points on the back end. Hey, I want you to compose my music. I know, music composition is expensive. Can I pay you a little bit and give you points? So that when we start bringing in revenue from the game, you're actually, earning in perpetuity.
Oh, yeah. That's a great idea.
So that's the way you can work with other people. And that's startup culture, at its very core. The funny thing is I've been blowing through Silicon Valley, and I look at a lot of the things, because I wrote my master's thesis on Founders Syndrome, and I've been watching Silicon Valley, and I've been doing a rewatch of Westworld season 1. And it's amazing to me, like, how much you can learn about what not to do as a founder by watching those two shows. One of them is as a new founder, and one of them is as an entrenched founder. And founder syndrome is when you have someone who creates the company and is so married to the company that they aren't comfortable giving up some of the control, that they compartmentalize information, that they deal with subordinates who are a threat to them by demeaning them or putting them in uncomfortable and embarrassing situations. So if you want to get an idea of what founder syndrome looks like when somebody is just starting up an organization and is very, focused on the technology or the creative, go watch Silicon Valley, because Richard has a number of features that are common of young founders who aren't able to really grasp what it means to transition from someone who has been a creative to someone who is now a leader across a business. And then on the Westworld side, we see this all the time in organizations. And again, I wrote my master's thesis on founder syndrome in nonprofit organizations. But if the thing about nonprofit arts organizations, and you look at nonprofit arts organizations, is they're marrying the creative and the business that supports the ability for people to go out and be creative. And video games aren't different than that. And Westworld, of course, is kind of an analog for the weirdness of how video games could evolve in the future. Robert Ford is what an entrenched founder looks like, and he does all of those things. It's power plays, it's putting people in embarrassing situations. One of the big subplots that kind of emerges from the middle to the last quarter of the first season is about the board of directors, which has been in deference to the creator, the founder, in a situation where the board's in a situation where they know the founder has them over a barrel. That if the founder walks away and wipes out all of the information on their way out, they have absolutely nothing. Their intellectual property is gone. So they have to resort to smuggling out their own intellectual property so that they can then remove the founder. Now, that's a late stage founder syndrome issue where the board looks at it and is like, yeah, we need to get rid of this guy. They're not good for morale. They're not good for the staff. We can no longer grow and evolve our company because the founder is in the way. That person is a barrier to growth and a barrier to success and survival.
Dang, that really sucks, right? When you're in the way of your own success, especially like when you're trying to, when you're making a game, you're gonna need artists and composers. And of course, independent developers, most of us probably won't have money to pay people. And so we're gonna have to give up some equity. It just, depending, you got to talk about how much and stuff. And that's going to be a long process in itself. Okay. Yeah. Let's talk about that. Like, how will we talk about the equity part? Like, how would the discussion go? What some good things we should do or not to do during that discussion?
Well, I think that, we're talking about two different kinds of revenue sharing. I mean, one of them is corporate equity and one of them, or company equity. and one of them is revenue sharing on a project. I suggest that you be very careful about who you give corporate equity to. Of course, this all necessitates that you have your business structures in place, and we do recommend very early on moving out of that sole proprietor phase, because being a sole proprietor and being in business, especially when you are paying people and you have relationships, can be very dicey, because if anything goes wrong, there is no difference. You are your business and your business is you, which means if someone has a grievance with your business and they sue the business, there's technically no entity that is the business. They're suing you individually, which means your breadth of personal assets are at stake. So we recommend that you get a more formalized corporate structure in place, whether that's a corporation or an LLC or a limited partnership, something that protects you and your personal assets from someone who has a grievance with your company. But assuming that you're talking about paying an artist partially in revenue share, paying a musician partially in revenue share, that's project based. So it's revenue for the game. One of the most interesting stories that I heard during interviewing for this is when Young Horses was working on Octodad. That was originally, I think it was an 18-person student project. And they did some interesting thing about vesting decision-making power with one person when they were at GDC, because they knew that 18 people in a room with a publisher, if they had an opportunity, was going to be unwieldy. So they chose someone to vest the decision-making abilities with. But what happened was and they did this for a year, who essentially, this was risky for them, and they're lucky they're lucky that nothing bad happened. But they vested everything in one person, so complete control of the IP, if I understood Phil Tibetowski correctly. And then this was for a year, so that they could go out and pitch, and they could have someone who was empowered to make decisions on behalf of the group. After a year, that control reverted equally to all the people who were involved in the original project. Then Young Horses was formed. And of course, not everybody on the original project joined the company. So then you had people who had equity in the company who were no longer involved even in the project. So they ran into this whole thing where then they had to buy people out and figure out how to deal with that. So I think at that point they were even having to send essentially notices for the board of trustees. So that whole story is actually in the book, and it was fascinating. It was one of the things that, Phil started talking about it when we met at GDC last year, and he's like, "Oh, this isn't boring. This isn't interesting." Well, I'm like, no. You keep talking about this, because this is a fascinating way that they handled their ability to make decisions in a more nimble fashion, but also some of the challenges that they ran into and how they structured their equity.
Interesting. So, okay, let's do this. So say that if you know for sure you're going to be working with that person for a long time, then obviously it'd be a good idea to give equity for the company equity. But then if you're going to contract someone and you're going to be working with them for a long time, like part-time or something like that, it's probably best to do a project-based, right?
Well, I think that you even want to be more methodical about giving corporate equity, because that marries, again, this is another wonderful opportunity to look at Silicon Valley as an interesting way, an interesting explanation of what can happen when you get into a partnership with the wrong person. There are multiple instances throughout that show, and I don't want to spoil it for anybody who hasn't watched it yet. But at one point, in desperation, Richard makes a bad deal and takes money from the wrong person, and that person ends up abusing their role, because the equity came with board seats. So that person ended up having 2 board seats at their disposal. There were 3 board seats for the other people. So if they were unified, the other side, they could make sure that the bad person, that the guy who was making bad decisions and had 2 board seats didn't get his way at all. But of course, it doesn't always go like that, and they became fractured. So you need to be very, very careful with corporate equity. You need to be very, very careful when you partner up with somebody. And that's something that Jordan Weissman drove home in the book. He talks about it being a very methodical decision, because once that person has a significant amount of equity in your company, not revenue share in a project, but equity in your company, you're with that person for a while. And if you want to divorce yourself from that person, I use that word very, very intentionally, because the marriage metaphor came up a lot when we were talking about equity. If you want to divorce yourself from that person, it's going to cost you. You're going to have to buy them out. And there's nothing that says, unless a deal is structured in a very specific way, There's nothing that says that they have to sell. So that person, if you have a falling out, could be a thorn in your side for a long, long time.
Oh, wow. Oh, man. Yeah. Do that research or
be methodical. Yeah. I mean, just be methodical when you're talking about getting into business with somebody at the partnership level. And make sure that person has skin in the game. You want to make sure that person has risk involved, because you don't want somebody playing with house money, because then they're not going to be making decisions. There's the temptation, or there's the lack of risk that, that's that voice in the back of your head being like, okay, if we get this wrong, then here's what I'm going to lose personally. Here's what we are going to lose as a business. Because if that person doesn't have any skin in the game, you're just throwing around corporate equity, you're going to run into a situation where people aren't taking their responsibilities seriously enough that you could run into a situation where someone's making bad decisions, even if it's not intentional. But not having that voice in the back of their head that they've got something on the line too is challenging.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, there's something on the line for them if they lose or if they lose money, something like that. There's some kind of risk involved for them as well. Yeah, definitely. That makes perfect sense. Yeah, if you had the opportunity to relay one message to game developers across the globe, what would you say and why?
One is just, again, don't overextend yourself. Live within your means. You might think you have a huge success on your hand, but until you ship that game, until you ship that success and you start earning revenue on it, there's no guarantee. But here's the thing that I think is really important. It's no longer good enough to have an amazing game. We are dealing with discoverability issues across platforms that we've never seen before. So it's important early on to think about your public relations and marketing messages. And I'll explain it like this. When I started out writing about games, the amount of press releases that I saw it's like Minecraft, but, think of Minecraft, and it's like, how many times are you going to just compare yourself to Minecraft? And of course we saw that, first it was sandbox games, and, of course it was, first person shooters, and then it was sandbox games, and then it was MOBAs, and, now we're into battle royale games. But even if it's a smaller game, that you're saying you're like, it's not enough. It's not enough. Even if your game's fantastic, if you can't communicate to people what's different about it, why it's worth their time, and if you can't do that early, you're going to get buried. And what I mean by that is you're only on the Steam front page, for instance, for a very limited amount of time, for a very limited number of impressions, and then you're off the front page. And with the number of Steam releases mounting year over year over year, I mean, we're seeing almost doubling of number of releases, for the past couple of years. Discoverability is an enormous challenge. So if you're not being thoughtful about how you're positioning your game early, if you decide to start thinking about that too late, it's the battle. Half the battle is already lost. Having a great game just isn't enough anymore. And that's unfortunate, because there's a lot of great stuff that's flying way under the radar.
Yep, I always tell my listeners, market as soon as you can. When you go. Have something. Marketing is it's like half the battle. You got to do it early. Yeah, especially with the discovery issue going on right now. You got to do it. So definitely do that. So now, Michael, we have reached the beta phase. I will ask you a rapid fire question so we can get this episode shipped. You ready, Michael?
Yes.
Why do you love being part of the video game industry?
It's a beautiful marriage of creative work, innovation, the ability for people to, improve on their ideas over time, married with, some of the coolest business innovations that I've seen. Now, not all of them are great, and we've seen some stumbles, especially this year and late last year. But it's the beautiful marriage of creative and business.
Oh yeah, it's so advancing so fast. So I'll always look forward to what's going to come out next. Mm-hmm. What do you think holds most people back from joining the game industry?
I think building networks. I think people don't know where to start. I think one of the reasons why we decided to write this book is because there wasn't anything like it. There were books that on the topic that have been written, but they were published before Steam was a thing, before mobile was a thing, before the indie game revolution happened. So I think that one of the things that holds people back is there's a lot of focus on the mechanics of building a game, and not as much focus on the mechanics of building a business to support game development.
Yes, that's so important. So you mentioned earlier that the last question to ask is, the best piece of advice they've they could give. So like, can you give us that advice? What advice is the best piece of advice you've ever received?
Don't take everything so personally.
Oh.
And this is something that I continue to work on, quite frankly, is that I take a lot of pride in my work. I am my work, and my work is me. And I put a lot of myself into whatever it is that I do. So, especially when you're writing, as a journalist and writing on the internet, and, social media is a quick way for people to tell you they don't like what you wrote.
Yeah.
And, I've gotten better, over the years about, responding to the people who are trying to engage you in a thoughtful debate versus people who are just looking to snipe and just being like, you know what? I'm just going to let it go. You're sniping at me for no reason. It's clear you didn't read the article. You didn't like my headline. You got about halfway through and you never actually, see it all come together. You're not being genuine in your interest in having a conversation versus the people who really are like, so I didn't think about that way. Here's the way I look at it. What are your thoughts? And it's like, okay, those are the people you can engage with and have a thoughtful civil conversation with. So being able to separate those things and not taking criticism personally, but understanding if you do get legitimate criticism, figuring out how you can incorporate that and thanking people for legitimate civil criticism.
Yes, I think people they focus too much on the negative and forget to thank the positive, the one that says, the positive critics. And so, I always suggest showing how humble you are or how grateful to say thank you to the people that gave great reviews or gave, thank you messages and great messages. So definitely they need more attention as well. What's a specific marketing tactic to stand out?
I think that going where your audience is, whether that's if you have a game that's perfectly streamable, if you have a game that's really engaging, then definitely engaging people on Twitch or Mixer who stream the type of game that you're making. So I wouldn't recommend going to an MMO streamer with a sports game. I wouldn't recommend going to a Minecraft streamer necessarily with a first-person shooter. But, finding your audience and going where they are. And that's same thing goes for traditional media, going and finding the writers who write about your genre. There are writers who focus on RPGs, who focus on sports games, who focus on shooters, who focus on esports. Go to those people and then, make smart use of social media. Social media has gotten so powerful, and I'm not just talking about the volumes of people, but the way you can put media forward. Nigel Lowry from Devolver was telling me that the reason they signed Downwell was because he saw a GIF and he loved it. Right. So, don't be afraid to try, to show the best bits of your games, even if they're only a few seconds long, and hook people and, make sure that you're giving people a way to find more. Don't stop the chain of communication there. Make sure that your website or your own Twitch channel or your Discord community, that's in your social media profile so people can find out more.
Yes, put yourself out there because I think that saying is if you're out of sight, out of mind, like the longer you stay out of sight, people's going to forget you. So you consistently want to put yourself out there so people remember you and stuff like that. What resources should we use today, for budgeting and for business?
Well, I will take the opportunity to do a little self-promotion here. My book's available, obviously, but one of the things that we wanted to do, you bring up budgeting specifically. And we do have a budgeting handbook coming out that focuses specifically on the process of budgeting and deep dives into some of the more, in some of the trickier areas. But on our website, gamedevbizbook.com, we've got a series of, digital supplements for the book that are completely free for anybody to look at. And included in those are budget templates and samples. So we created templates that people can use. They can download. It's a Google Doc. You can download it. You can play around with it. It auto calculates some of the things like man month cost, which we call dev month in the book. But we also have samples in there with narratives to go along with them. So let's say you're working on your very first project and you don't know how to go about valuing your time. And we think this is really important that even when you're not compensating yourself, that you track your time and that you value your time so you understand how much your project would have cost if everybody were getting paid for their hours. So we've got a sample for that and a narrative that goes along with it that runs down the whole thing and says, okay, here's why we put this together. And what I did when I wrote this was I created a fake studio and wrote their story. and then, how they approached their budgeting process. And then we've got another one that's for, your first project, after, that's bringing in revenue. So you've shipped your first game. You did it part-time for most of the time. You didn't pay yourself. All right. So your next game, you're bringing revenue in from your first game sales. Now you're paying yourself. So here's how to put one of those budgets together. It's a bigger budget. It's a bigger project. You have more contractors involved. And then the third one is how to deal with when you've got your first project with publisher funding. So in there, we start dealing with cash flow a little bit more clearly, because then you've got milestones and you've got publisher payments. And we talk about the delay in payments and how, most of these are net 30. So even though you make a milestone, the milestone's approved, you might not get your payment for 30 days, and how that impacts, the way you have to handle your cash. So we've got all three of those samples, and then we've got blank templates to go along with all of those, as well as, and we have narratives for all three of those different samples. And there's a couple of other digital supplements in there, but that's the most valuable one for sure.
Yeah, I would definitely link those up. And that actually leads well to our next question. So imagine you woke up the next morning in a brand new world and you knew no one. And like you say, you already create like an imaginary studio or something like that. Mm-hmm. And don't worry about your food and shelter, because that's taken care of, and you have a laptop. What would you do step by step on a path to join and become successful in the game industry?
Well, that's a big question.
Oh yeah.
Well, I think the first thing that you need to do is you need to have a good idea. You need to have an idea that you're passionate about. So if you've already got that in place, you need to figure out the resources you need in order to bring that project to reality. And what I recommend to people is start with your pie in the sky budget. If I had, unlimited resources, here are the number of artists I'd want, the number of coders that I'd want. Here's what I would want for QA. Here's how much time I would want to spend, in each of the different phases. And then you have to look at that and say, all right, let's plug all those numbers in and figure out what that budget looks like. And when that number makes your eyes fall out of your head because it's way too big, then you have to figure out where you can reasonably pare back. But I always recommend starting big and then cutting until you reach a project that is both feasible in terms of scope and feasible in terms of your budget. And from that point, it's a matter of that shuffle step of we need to make sure that the business is moving along and that your finances are being managed, while you're dealing with the development of the creative product.
Yes, focus on your strength, game devs. Yeah, definitely. Do everything that he just mentioned. We have reached a gold. Thank you so much. Tell us how we can connect with you and anything else you want to mention, and then we'll say goodbye.
Sure. For me, I'm on Twitter at Futterish, Futterish. You can, my DMs are open, so feel free if you have any questions, about, your business. If you need any quick guidance, feel free to hit me up. And if you're interested in purchasing a copy of the Game Dev Business Handbook, the website is gamedevbizbook.com. We're also available on Amazon in hardcover in the US and Kindle around the world. And then the budgeting handbook, the manuscript is done, art is in process, and layout begins in a couple weeks, and that will be out before I know it, probably before the end of the summer. And that will be launching digital first, so that'll be Kindle first, and I think maybe EPUB as well, though we haven't locked all of that stuff down. But yeah, that'll be out in a couple of weeks, or a couple months rather.
Awesome! All the best on your book, Michael. It's been a pleasure, and we will catch you next time.
Great. Thank you so much, Tom.
Great. I hope you enjoyed the interview with Mike. You can check him out on his website. Thanks again to Mike for helping us out. Like he mentioned, it's so important for us to focus on our strength and not waste time with our weakness. So definitely evaluate your opportunity costs. For all these show notes, you can go to gamedevloadout.com/93. That is gamedevloadout.com/93. Once again, thank you all for listening in. Make sure you subscribe to the show if you haven't already. Until then, cheers, and I'll catch you on the next episode.